Since ancient times, Buddhist masters have safeguarded profound secrets about the nature of the human mind. They discovered that every individual carries within them a universe of thoughts, emotions, and experiences that can be understood through attentive observation and compassionate wisdom. This is a story that will guide you along the paths of profound understanding of the human mind, beginning with the first and most fundamental step, the awakening of perception. The mist shrouded the mountains that morning as a young monk swept the leaves in the monastery courtyard. His thoughts were as restless as the leaves dancing in the wind. He had arrived at the monastery only 3 moons ago, yet he already felt lost among the hundreds of faces he encountered daily. He observed his companions during meals, in meditation practices, and during their work, but he couldn't truly understand them. Frustration grew in his chest like an unwelcome seed. He watched the eldest master of the monastery interact with the other monks, noticing how the master seemed to deeply know each of them, addressing their needs even before they voiced their doubts. How was it possible to develop such profound understanding? On that particular morning, as he wrestled with these thoughts, the young monk noticed something different in the air. The wind blew in a peculiar way, carrying with it the scent of lotus flowers blooming in the sacred lake. His calloused hands paused on the bamboo broom, and for the first time since his arrival, he truly observed the world around him. He saw how the tree leaves danced differently. Some resisted the wind, while others surrendered to its motion. He realized that, like the leaves, each person in the monastery had their own way of moving, breathing, and existing. Some monks walked with firm, decisive steps, while others glided gently across the stone floor, as if afraid to disturb the very air. The young monk began noticing subtle patterns. The monk who always sat in the corner during meals had a slight tremor in his hands when anxious. The elderly nun who tended the herb garden hummed softly when at peace, but fell completely silent on days when her arthritis flared up. The novice who arrived after him had a habit of rubbing his thumb against his palm when about to ask an important question. As he continued his task of sweeping, now with renewed attention, he realized that every movement around him told a story. The way someone held their bowl of rice, adjusted their robes, or the rhythm of their breathing, all were small windows into that person's mind. The hours passed like moments as he immersed himself in this new form of observation. The sun was already high in the sky when the young monk noticed his broom had stopped moving entirely. He had been so absorbed in his observations that his work had taken a back seat, but something inside him had changed. An understanding began to awaken, like a sprout breaking through the earth in spring. In that moment, he realized that the true art of reading minds did not begin with mysterious techniques or supernatural powers. It began with something much simpler, yet far deeper: the ability to truly see, to be present, to observe with one's entire being. The young monk resumed his task, but now each movement of the broom was a meditation. Each leaf he gathered was a lesson about the nature of reality. And so, as the sun continued its journey across the sky, he began his own journey of discovery, unaware that this was only the first step in a much greater transformation to come. The courtyard was nearly clean when a shadow crossed his path. It was the old master, the one who seemed to read everyone's thoughts. The old master stopped in front of the young monk, his eyes glowing with ancient wisdom. Without saying a word, he gestured for the young man to follow him. Together, they walked to a small pavilion near the lotus flower lake. The air was thick with the fragrance of the flowers and the gentle murmur of the water. "You've been observing a lot today," the master said, breaking the silence. The young monk's heart skipped a beat. How could the master know about his observations that morning? But before he could express his surprise, the master continued, "Your eyes are different now, more attentive, more alive, like the surface of this lake when it is perfectly still." The master approached the edge of the lake and motioned for the young monk to join him. The water's surface was so clear it perfectly reflected the sky above, the clouds, the surrounding trees, and their own faces. "What do you see?" asked the master. "I see our reflections, venerable master," the young monk replied. "Look deeper," instructed the master, picking up a small stone and tossing it into the water. The reflections distorted entirely, transforming into concentric ripples that spread to the edges of the lake. "Now, what do you see?" The young monk watched as the turbulence gradually subsided and the surface returned to its tranquil clarity. "I see that when the water is disturbed, I can't see anything clearly. But when it is calm again, everything becomes clear." A smile spread across the master's face. "The minds of people are like this lake. When disturbed by thoughts, emotions, and worries, it is impossible to see their true nature. But when calm, it becomes a perfect mirror, reflecting the truth without distortion." The master then took a small bell from his robes and rang it gently. The crystal clear sound resonated through the air, causing some birds to take flight from the nearby trees. "Close your eyes and tell me what happens to the sound." The young monk closed his eyes, listening intently as the bell's sound began strong and gradually faded until it was just a memory in his mind. When he opened his eyes, the master was watching him intently. Just like the sound of the bell, every person emits constant signals about their mental state. Some are loud and clear, like the initial chime, while others are subtle, like the faintest echoes. To read these signals, your mind must be as calm as this lake in its natural state. Over the following hours, the master taught the young monk how to observe his own mind, how to notice when it was agitated by thoughts and emotions, and how to let that agitation naturally settle, just as the lake's waters return to clarity after being disturbed. "The true art of understanding others," the master explained, "begins with understanding yourself. Every irritation you perceive in others is a reflection of agitation within your own mind. Every judgment you make is a ripple in your own inner lake." As the sun began to set, the master rose to his feet. "Starting tomorrow, you will have a new task. Instead of sweeping the courtyard, you will come to this lake every morning. Your task will be to observe your reflection in the water until you can see beyond the surface." The young monk bowed deeply, his heart brimming with gratitude. As the master walked away, the monk remained by the lake, watching as the last light of day danced upon the water. A gentle breeze stirred, creating small ripples on the surface, and he realized he now saw these disturbances in a completely different way. Night fell over the monastery, and as it did, the first stars appeared in the sky, their light reflecting on the lake's surface like diamonds scattered across black velvet. The stars were still shimmering in the sky when the young monk arrived at the lake the next morning. The surface of the water was so still it looked like a black mirror placed upon the earth. He sat in the same position as the day before and began observing his reflection, following the master's instructions. Gradually, the sky brightened, and with the first light of dawn, he began to see his face reflected more clearly in the water. He noticed details he had never paid attention to before. Faint worry lines on his forehead, a slight tremor at the corner of his lips, the way his eyes blinked rapidly when a thought crossed his mind. The sun was already high when the master appeared silently by his side. "What did you see?" he asked in his calm voice. "I saw my face, venerable master," the young monk replied. "I saw how it changes subtly with each thought, with each emotion." The master nodded and then did something unexpected. He picked up a fallen leaf and placed it on the surface of the water, right where the young monk's reflection had been. "Now, what do you see?" he asked. "I see the leaf, master." "And what happened to your reflection?" "It disappeared." "The leaf covered it completely." The master smiled. "This is your first true lesson. When we observe others, we often see only the leaf, the surface, the mask they show to the world. We think we're seeing the person, but in reality, we're only seeing what lies on the surface. With a gentle motion, The master blew the leaf aside, revealing the monk's reflection once more. To truly understand someone's mind, we must learn to see beyond the leaf, beyond the surface. Over the next few hours, the master taught the young monk how various elements could distort or conceal the reflection in the water. A sudden gust of wind creating ripples, a falling leaf, a single raindrop. Each disturbance altered the clarity of the reflection. People are like this, the master explained. Their minds are constantly disturbed by external and internal events. A harsh word is like a stone thrown into their inner waters. A worry is like a steady wind rippling the surface. A deep fear is like an underwater current, distorting everything above. The young monk watched attentively as the master demonstrated each example on the lake's surface. "But master," he asked, "how can we see someone's true nature through all these disturbances?" The master picked up a small hollow piece of bamboo and partially submerged it in the water. "Look through this bamboo," he instructed. The young monk leaned forward and peered through the bamboo. To his surprise, the small circular area he saw through it was perfectly clear, even though the rest of the lake was agitated by a breeze. When we focus our attention, just as this bamboo focuses our vision, we can see through surface disturbances. This is the art of deep observation. It's not about seeing everything at once, but knowing where and how to look. The master then asked the young monk to close his eyes and listen. For several minutes, only the natural sounds of the monastery filled his ears. Birds singing, the wind in the trees, distant bells, the footsteps of other monks. Each person has their own rhythm, just as each sound you just heard does. Some are loud and clear, like the temple bell, while others are subtle, like the rustle of leaves. The art of understanding others' minds lies in learning to hear all these rhythms, all these notes. The sun was high in the sky when the master rose again. Keep practicing. Observe your own reflection until you know every nuance, every change. Only when you can read your own mind clearly will you be ready to begin understanding the minds of others. The young monk remained seated by the lake, his gaze alternating between his reflection and the bamboo the master had left beside him. The surface of the water continued to shift, just like his thoughts, but now he was beginning to see patterns in the changes, meanings in the disturbances. The days turned into weeks and the weeks into months as the young monk continued his practice by the lake. Summer had given way to autumn, and golden leaves now danced on the surface of the water where he engaged in his daily observation. His gaze had deepened, becoming more focused, as though he had developed a new way of seeing. On a particularly cold morning, while observing his reflection in the crystal-clear water, he noticed he could pinpoint the exact moment a thought arose in his mind, even before it manifested in his expression. It was like watching a waveform in the depths before reaching the surface. The master, who appeared silently and unexpectedly, arrived at his side at that very moment. "You are ready," he said. "Today, we will begin a new phase of your training." For the first time in months, they left the lake, and the master led the young monk to the monastery's dining hall. It was breakfast time, and dozens of monks had gathered in silence for their first meal of the day. "Observe," the master instructed, "but not just with your eyes." The young monk sat quietly in a corner of the dining hall and began to observe. At first, he saw only what he had always seen: monks eating in silence. But gradually, like the morning mist lifting, he began to notice subtle patterns he had never perceived before. He noticed how an elderly nun held her bowl in a peculiar way, her fingers trembling slightly, not from weakness, he realized, but from a profound reverence for the food. He saw how a young novice chewed with restrained haste, his entire body leaning forward in barely disguised anxiety. "What do you see?" the master whispered. "I see stories," the young monk replied. "Every movement tells a different story. That monk over there," he added, pointing subtly with his gaze, His breathing is uneven, and his shoulders are tense. He is worried about something. The master nodded. Continue. The nun near the window. She keeps her eyes lowered, but not in contemplation. There's sadness in her movements, as if she carries an invisible burden. In the weeks that followed, the master took the young monk to various parts of the monastery. In the library, they observed how people held the sutras, some with fearful reverence, others with loving familiarity. In the garden, they noticed how some monks moved among the plants like dancers, while others walked with the heavy steps of worry. The mind leaves its marks in every gesture, the master explained. It is present in the way someone folds their robes, in the rhythm of their breathing, in the tilt of their head. It is not through tricks or secret techniques that we come to understand others. It is by truly seeing what is before us. One day, as they watched the sunset from the top of a hill, the master introduced a new teaching. Now that you have learned to see the signs, you must learn not to react to them. What do you mean, Venerable Master? When we see deeply into someone, it is natural to want to help, to fix, to intervene. But sometimes, the greatest help we can offer is simply to understand and be present. The young monk thought of the dozens of stories he had read over the past days, the worries, joys, fears, and hopes he had perceived in others. How do we know when to act and when to simply observe? The master smiled. That is the next lesson you must learn. For now, continue observing. But now, observe your own reaction to what you see. Every interpretation we make is colored by our own experiences, our own fears and desires. The sun had disappeared below the horizon, leaving only a golden glow in the sky as the master rose to leave. Tomorrow, he said, you will begin to learn the difference between seeing and interpreting, between understanding and judging. The next morning, while stars still dotted the sky, the master found the young monk already seated in his usual observation spot. This time, however, instead of guiding him to observe others, the master handed him a polished bronze mirror. Today, the master said, you will observe your own reactions as you observe others. This mirror is not for seeing your face, but for reflecting your internal judgments. Throughout the day, the young monk carried the mirror as he observed life in the monastery. Each time he noticed something about someone, he would look into the mirror, not to see his reflection, but to examine the thoughts and emotions arising within his mind. He realized how quickly he created entire stories based on small details. When he saw an elder monk furrowing his brow while reading a sutra, he immediately assumed the monk was struggling to understand it. But as he observed more closely, he noticed a subtle smile on the monk's face. It wasn't confusion, but deep contemplation that shaped his expression. Do you see how quick we are to color what we observe with our own experiences? The master asked, appearing silently by his side. Every interpretation we make is like a veil we place over reality. The young monk began to notice patterns in his own interpretations. He saw how he tended to perceive sadness in those who walked slowly, simply because he himself slowed his pace when feeling melancholic. He realized he often assumed that people who gestured a lot were anxious, when they were often just enthusiastic. Master, he said after several days of practice, the more I observe, the less it feels like I truly know what I'm seeing. The master smiled. Now you are beginning to truly understand. True wisdom begins when we recognize how little we actually know. One afternoon, while they watched a group of novices practicing meditation, the master posed a new challenge. Look at each of them, and before forming any interpretation, ask yourself, what do I truly see? And what am I adding to the scene? The young monk observed carefully. He saw one novice shifting constantly. His first impulse was to think the novice was restless or unfocused. But when he separated observation from interpretation, he realized he was simply seeing movement. The meaning of that movement was a story his mind was constructing. The mind is like an eager storyteller, the master explained. It's always trying to weave narratives, connect dots, and find meaning. There's nothing wrong with that. It's its nature. But we must learn to distinguish the story from reality. Days turned into weeks, and the young monk began to notice a profound shift in how he saw the world. Where he once saw people as happy or sad, he now saw specific facial expressions, body postures, and breathing patterns. Where he once made snap judgments, there was now a pause, a space between observation and interpretation. One morning, as he watched the sunrise reflected on the lake, he had a sudden realization. "Master," he said, "I spent so much time trying to learn how to read the minds of others that now I see that what I've truly learned is how to read my own mind." The master nodded in approval. And isn't that the true key to understanding others? When we deeply know our own mind, we begin to recognize its patterns in others. When we see through our own illusions, we can see through the illusions of others. The young monk looked at the bronze mirror he still carried. His reflection appeared different, now clearer, more real, as if a fog had lifted. "What happens now, venerable master?" "Now," the master said, taking the mirror and setting it aside, "you are ready for the final lesson." Before the sun rose, the master led the young monk back to the lake where everything had begun. The surface of the water was perfectly still, mirroring the starry sky above. But this time, something was different. Where once the young monk had only seen reflections, he now perceived layers of meaning in every ripple, every glimmer of light. "Your final lesson," the master said, "is to understand that there is no real separation between the observer and the observed." The master picked up a lotus leaf and gently placed it on the water. "What do you see now?" A young monk gazed deeply. "I see the leaf, master, but I also see how it connects with the water, how it creates ripples that spread outward, how it alters the reflection of the stars. I see that I cannot separate the leaf from the water, nor the water from the sky it reflects. And when you look at people, now I understand that I cannot truly separate what I see in them from what I see in myself. Every observation I make, every insight I have, is like this lotus leaf interconnected with everything around it." The master smiled. "You have discovered the true secret to reading minds. It is not a technique to master, but an understanding to reach. Every person you meet is like this lake, a reflection of the entire universe." As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the master shared his final teaching. The mind is not something that can be read like a book, for it is not separate from the one who reads it. When we truly understand this, every person we meet becomes a mirror of our own awareness, and every interaction becomes an opportunity to awaken. The young monk watched as the first rays of sunlight transformed the surface of the lake. "So, master, all those times when you seemed to read my thoughts, I was merely seeing clearly what was before me, without adding or subtracting anything. When we remove our own projections, biases, and judgments, what remains is the bare truth, not only about others, but about ourselves." At that moment, a flock of birds flew over the lake, their reflections dancing on the water. The young monk observed how each bird created its own ripples, which intertwined and interacted in intricate, beautiful ways. "Such are the minds of people," the master said. "Each creates its own ripples in the great web of consciousness. The true art is not in reading these ripples, but in understanding that we are all part of the same lake." And so, as the sun rose higher on the horizon, the young monk grasped the final message of his teachings. The true art of reading minds lies not in mysterious techniques or special powers, but in the ability to see clearly, undistorted by our own thoughts and judgments. It is the deep understanding that every person we encounter is a reflection of our own awareness, and that true wisdom comes not from deciphering others, but from cultivating clarity within ourselves. The master rose to leave, but before departing, he offered one last reflection. "Always remember, When your mind is as clear as this lake on a calm morning, you do not need to read others' thoughts. You understand them naturally, for you recognize in each person the same infinite sky reflected within yourself. The young monk remained seated by the lake, no longer an eager student seeking tricks to read minds, but someone who had discovered a far deeper truth. The true understanding of others begins with understanding oneself, and that the easiest mind to read is one at peace with itself.